Hello, and welcome to Curated Conversations, a podcast presented by GRAAHI. My name is Ashley Jones, and I have the pleasure of being today's host. On today's podcast, we are having a very candid conversation related to mental health. There's so many components of it, but today we have two phenomenal guests to help us navigate this very, very vulnerable conversation. We have Reverend Dr. Charles Hudson, who indeed is a pillar in our community. He is a 2024 Giant Award recipient and also was assigned to the 82nd Airborne Division at Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and completed one tour of duty with the Southern European Task Force in Vicenza, Italy. Additionally, we have Ms. Tashuna Hunt, who is the owner and lead therapist at A Space for Change Therapeutic Services. Not only is she a licensed master social worker, she is also a mental health advocate. So today's conversation will indeed be thoughtful, but empowering at the end. So I'll go ahead and start with the very first question, and whomever would like to answer first, feel free. But I'd love to hear a little bit more about the two of you, and I'd love to hear more about your personal experiences as it relates to mental health and how it has impacted your life.
Well, I have been a social worker since I was a kid. Social work started before school. I was always a person that would notice when someone was struggling and needed an extra hand of support. So I was that person to befriend those who didn't always have friends. And so it started for me early there in noticing that there was a need for support for others. I didn't have the language for that at the time, but recognizing that different family members and friends may have been experiencing anxiety and even depression. And so from there, as I began to learn more about mental health, that really pushed me into the education piece and learning more about how to support people clinically as they navigate their mental health journeys. Just a little bit more about myself.
First, I'm excited to be here today to have the opportunity to talk a little bit about mental health, something that I have made a part of my ministry outreach. I am a licensed ordained minister. I have been for 28 years. Grew up in the rural south of Louisiana, moved here when I was 10 years old, and grew up in the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan. And just had the opportunity to be mentored by a lot of strong individuals in the religious community, educational community, and professionals of different walks of life. And so I have just felt it incumbent upon me to give back to the community. But my connection in the mental health piece of what we're talking about, it starts in my community and in my family. Mm-hmm. I had a couple individuals who experienced mental health for the most part of their lives. They had been hospitalized. And as a young kid growing up, you see it. You don't know how to interpret it or internalize it, but you just know that there's someone in the family who's really not normal by our standards. Mm-hmm. And as you grow up, and you see more of it in different walks in life. And another aspect of it was as a military veteran. As a military veteran, not only did I see and witness a lot of post-traumatic stress disorder, but I experienced it myself. And so having to seek help, seek treatment, seek therapy, and to end up on the other side a better person, I just felt it became very incumbent upon me to reach out and to try to work with the various agencies and the various organizations that deal with the mental health aspect in the African American community, which is where I am now with the GRAAHI, I Belong Strong program, where we do African American veteran outreach as it applies to mental health.
Yeah. And I think it's so important, the conversation that's being had today, because there are so many people who will either view this podcast or they'll hear this podcast that might be in the valley of decision around, do I seek help? Or if they are like yourself, Tashuna, they're younger and they're like, hey, there's something that's happening and I don't know what the answer is, but I think I can find it. Mm-hmm. This can empower them to do so, because you never really know where the help is going to come from. And the help does not always come in a traditional format.
Yes.
Absolutely.
You know, sometimes the help comes by way of the child that seems to not be paying attention to anything, that's noticing everything.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
So I think that part is important, but I also know that there are many misconceptions that surround the idea of mental health crisis, the need for support for someone that is, dare I say, navigating the minefields of the mind. Right, that's a
Absolutely.
very difficult place
Absolutely.
to be. So, Tashuna, what would you say are some of the common misconceptions around mental health?
Yes, I'm glad you asked that because I was thinking as Dr. Charles was speaking, with thinking about community, some of the misconceptions, I immediately thought about two young men that grew up in my community, that there was clearly some things that was different about them. Again, not having the language. And so the community rallied around them. No one messed with them because we knew that there was something different about them and we had to care for them and take care of them. We didn't have the language of autism or any other mental health diagnosis, but when I look back on those moments, I just think about, wow, what if they had the help? So some of the misconceptions that come to mind, and that stigma piece is so real in the Black community, is people are gonna think I'm crazy if I seek help.
Right.
Or nothing's wrong with me. I think about working in a school setting earlier in my career, and I remember talking to a young woman about her child. He was referred to me for therapy services. And at that time, I reached out to her and I talked to her about bringing her son on. And so at the time, she was like, nothing is wrong with him. That was her immediate response. She was like, there's nothing wrong with him. He's fine. I said, no, he is fine. I just want to see how I can support you as the therapist here. And so the more we began to have this conversation, she was able to connect the dots to who I was. She was like, are you the one that you're usually standing by the door? And then she said, do you drive an Impala? And I was kind of like, wait a minute, I didn't know where this was going. And I was a little nervous to say,
Like,
yes.
why do you know my car?
How do you know my car? And I said, yes, I do. She said, oh, and you can, over the phone, I can feel her calm. She said, you know what? Yes. And she became open. So the stigma around seeking mental health services in the Black community in particular, being is something wrong with me, or that means I'm crazy, or people are going to look at me different, that is very real. And that's what I love about us having this conversation today. So I was able to get that young man connected, and we started therapy services and was able to just kind of move him along in that process. But I just think there is something wrong with me is always screaming loud and just loud. And I just want us to know that there is something right with you. And with the right support, you can become the better version of yourself.
Absolutely.
I agree with that 1,000%. I think that people sometimes treat their mind as if it's separate from the body, right? If my arm is broken, then I'm going to go and see about the arm,
Yes.
right? If my stomach is upset, I'm going to go and see what's happening with my stomach. Or every year we have a physical just to keep what's right.
Yes.
So if I'm willing to do that for my physical self, how much more important is it for me to do it for my mental self, right?
Absolutely.
Holistically.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So Dr. Hudson, what would you say are some of those misconceptions, especially as a vet?
I'm going to back up a little bit before we get to the veteran piece. And I want to talk about some of the cultural influences that shaped my view or my perspective of mental health. When we look at growing up in an African-American community, what's the greatest influence you have? Church.
That's it.
You grow up in a church.
good.
I happen to grow up in a Baptist church. Uncles were pastors and preachers. My father was a pastor, preacher. As the oldest of 8 children, you're growing up in a church and you're going to church all day. And so
It's literally all day.
It's
All
difficult.
day.
It's difficult for people who are influenced by religion to accept the clinical diagnosis of mental health. And it's also it's kind of two different trains of thought. In the theological community, having matriculated through the theological school in religion, one of the books that we read was a book by Francis Frangipane called The Three Battlefields of the Mind. The battlefield of the church, the battlefield of heavenly places and the battlefield of the mind, or the three battlefields of Satan. And so what you just mentioned, Ashley, about those spiritual battlefields in the mind, we see them in our biblical scriptures when we talk about demonic possession. And a lot of the times we will attribute to people having with mental health issues as a demonic issue. And we would say, well, we need to pray for this individual. All they need to do is pray for him, and we're overlooking the fact that there's a serious disconnect from a physiological standpoint in the mind, where this person really has a chemical imbalance that's causing them to have this experience. And so that's part of the stigma that you talked about. We don't want to admit that we're crazy. There's something spiritual wrong or something like that. And so I'm so fortunate, and I'm so glad that I was asked by Vanessa Green, the CEO of GRAAHI, to work with her and work with you and your team and try to work with the veterans who have that mental health aspect going on with PTSD, but it has that stigma attached to it in the African American community. When they come back from battle, come back from war, oh, he's just shell-shocked. There's nothing wrong with blah, 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 blah. But these are serious issues that we have in the African American community. And I think that the way that you're addressing it in the Grand Rapids African American Health Institute is huge. And I'm fortunate to be a part of that initiative. So hopefully that answers a little bit of your question.
Oh, no, it most definitely does, because, what it did was kind of lead into the portion of the conversation organically where we talk about challenges, right?
Absolutely.
There is so many different challenges to seeking mental health services. So number one, we've already identified stigma, right? Stigma can show its ugly self in many different ways, depending on what portion of community you are, like whatever your purview is from community standard. But then also when you start thinking about some of the challenges related to accessing care, do I have what I need?
Yes.
Right?
Absolutely.
Do I have access to what I need? There's always a talk about, resources, and that's great, but when you are the person that does not know what those resources are, or they seem to be inevitably out of reach.
Absolutely.
Now we've got a different type of a challenge. There are some that may be willing to, kind of launch out into the deep and get the support that we're talking about here. But there's so many challenges to seeking out health resources. And us as civilians, I'm sure that the challenges we have are very different sometimes than the challenges as those that have served our country.
Absolutely.
Because we have to navigate the roads differently. So as we're talking about some of those challenges and, who they may talk to or how to start the conversations, like what does that look like from a veteran's perspective, especially for those that you mentioned are suffering from PTSD. And then Tashuna, I'd love for you to talk about it from the clinical standpoint, things that you're noticing.
Thank you. I want to share my personal experience, and that may give us some insight to the path that I followed, and it will also help to understand some of the obstacles, some of the glaring differences of obtaining mental health with the Veterans Administration. When I returned, I had some of the same issues that a lot of veterans face: unable to get employment, had not completed my education at that time, so job opportunities were not there. And so you fall into these pitfalls. Number one, you start drinking. You start using drug abuse, which I suffered for. I had a 15-year substance abuse issue. And before I really sought the help that I needed, I went through several phases, incarceration, all of that. And so as I sit here and I think about it, people actually say, "Oh, Dr. Hudson, you mean you?" Yes, I did. I had to go through all of that. And once I really found that the VA had the help that I needed, there still was a little pushback, But the thing that you mentioned, Ashley, is where does a civilian go if they don't have that support system like the Veterans Administration to say, hey, look, come here and we can get you the help that you need. I was fortunate. I was blessed to be able to get the help that I needed. And once I got involved with the VA process, the long-term care, actually getting psychotherapy and seeing psychiatrists and all of that, even the holistic part, the rehealing of your body, because your body takes on a severe damage when you don't take care of yourself, when you're abusing it with drugs, alcohol, or whatever that is. And so it's all compounded. But when I got the help that I needed, and I started going to the classes at the long-term care in Battle Creek where you go see a psychiatrist once a week, and I was able to talk about things that I never was able to unravel. You start talking about having classes on why you have a disposition to drug use. Why can't some other people just have a beer and go home and go to bed and get up and go to work? And you can't do that. Why can't you do that? What's wrong with me? And so I started unraveling all of these things, and that's when the healing started. I started to really address some of the things, underlying issues that was causing me to seek alcohol and drugs and all of that. And it really helped me. And I made that turn, and I turned that corner. And when I turned that corner and realized, okay, I just cannot do these things. I can't drink. Not even a beer. I don't, it's been over 20-some years now. And I still find myself, it's kind of funny. I can be around people who do that and drink and socialize and all that stuff, and it doesn't affect me at all. And so that was part of my healing process. And so one of the things that I do as a facilitator of the outreach for African-American veterans is I share my story and let them know that you are not alone and that there is help. We have some really, really good agencies now that work with African-American veterans of all colors, not just African-American, but there's so much help out there now that they can get. And it's not cost prohibitive, which is the other thing that you talked about, Ashley. If you change that whole scenario and you take a civilian who does not have those resources, then that's problematic. And that's where the health disparities come in the African American community, because there are those obstacles. People can't just go book time with a psychiatrist. That's expensive.
Yeah, it definitely is. And it's almost, in so many words, it amplifies the fear.
It does, yes.
Because if I'm already struggling in this space and I can't seem to get my head above water, just in life in general, then I don't want to add on an additional thing, because we hear oftentimes people that reach out to GRAAHI, the very first question they ask is, well, how much is this going to cost me? Right. And if I already am living in a space where there is like housing insecurity, if there is food insecurities, if there are all these other stressors, right, then the idea of seeking help sounds like more money I don't have.
Absolutely.
Which can be very, very challenging. But that's why I'm really, really grateful for GRAAHI and what we do, because we're able to seek out resources and we can create a space where people can ask the questions, because we've already done the work to find out, here are your resources. And no, we've tried to eliminate, the barrier of cost. We've tried to eliminate barriers of accessibility, right? Here are some types of assistance that you can have as far as transportation is concerned. Or here are some, clinicians that are along a bus line. Like, we try to make sure, or let's find a day and time. Maybe GRAAHI needs to create a time and place where we have clinicians in a space and you can come and have a 15-minute consult, at the very least start the conversation. But in terms of like civilians, right, or just in general, that's why, Tashuna, like, your voice is so important to this conversation, because what you bring is not only the information and the access to, but then also being a woman and a woman of color that is a clinician.
Yes.
Right. Many of us don't want to sit with someone that does not look like us.
Absolutely.
So I'd love to kind of hear a little bit more about, some of the challenges that you've seen or even have witnessed people overcome.
Yes.
By doing the hard thing, by taking the first step.
Absolutely. So definitely when you talk about looking for a therapist that look like you, I see teens and women. I see mostly women and predominantly African-American women. And so a lot of my clients have come to therapy for the first time, which I think is dope. Our mission was to create a space for women of color and teens to feel seen, heard, and valued.
Ding, ding, ding.
Yes.
Space for change.
Space for change. And so we've created that space, and I'm very proud of it. A lot of the women are coming for the first time. And so I get to kind of hear from them. They're very scared when they come. So though if you're looking for a therapist, it can be scary. However, you have therapists that are in place to support you. And they want to be here for you. So just know that it can be scary, but you got this, and it is definitely you're worth it.
Can you say that one more time just in case somebody was not paying attention?
Yes. If you're seeking therapy, yes, it can be scary. However, there are therapists that are waiting to receive you, and you're worth it. You are worth it. You are worth it.
Well said.
Yes.
Well said.
You're worth it. And so just really recognizing that it can be hard. I think that just the topic of finding a therapist that look like you, we're here. There is a directory of BIPOC clinicians that is our mental health collective. And so for that, you can look at our OURMHC.org and look. There is a wealth of Black and brown therapists in this community that is here to support you. And so I think that could be a barrier. Working in different spaces myself, there's times when I have had therapists that didn't know who they were going to meet. And once we got to my office, a lot of times they would feel relieved. They would look at me and say, oh my gosh, I feel like everything is going to be okay. And so I just want our community to know that we definitely have clinicians of color that can take you on and that's here for you. Other challenges I would say is definitely, we talked about the financial piece that is there. Most of us take insurances. And so we're here to meet you, to take on insurances, to help you in that process of navigating the financial piece.
I want to put this out, Ashley, for us to consider. Okay, I consider myself a quasi-philosopher, if you will.
I can agree with that.
A couple of things that I thought about as it applies to mental health in the African American community. And we have to put everything into context whenever we're talking about mental health, when we're talking about things that are this significant in our culture, because there are cultural variances that we have to take into consideration. You know, if we look at mental health in general in the overall society, people going to see a psychiatrist, that's not a big deal. Wealthy families, I'm sure they've been doing this for generations. One of the normal things, the wife with 3 or 4 kids and the husband's at work, a businessman or lawyer or whatever, and she's doing what she does. Oh, I have to go see my psychiatrist on Wednesday at 4 o'clock, okay, for 30 minutes, 45 minutes. It's just a normal thing to do.
Way of life.
What I think the mental health practitioners and what the mental health professionals have to consider now is that the African American people, we have a collective trauma that we have to incorporate into who we are.
Yeah. Absolutely.
That's been a burden put on us for all of those number of years that we were in servitude, in involuntary servitude with slavery. So that's a collective post-traumatic trauma that we have.
Yeah. Yes, it is.
So, and then for society to think that we should just act normal, take it on the chin, pick yourself up, get in the race, you'll be okay. That's not a realistic expectation, I think.
Not at all.
And if you add in those personal childhood traumas, undiagnosed childhood traumas that we go through, that we have, especially in African American families, sexual trauma in African American families, it's gone undiagnosed. So by the time the young boys get into 5th, 6th grade, they're acting out. There's that ADHD, as it has been diagnosed as. What is that really from? And then they're quick to put them on medication. Okay, and that affects them for the remainder of their years that they're in school, and that's why they underperform.
That's right.
But we really need to take a collective view. The professional community of mental health practitioners, they really need to look at how has that affected us as a collective community. Okay, and I think that you will find that if we can point out some of the reasons why we are behind in a lot of areas and why we do not perform at a higher level in educational environments and stuff like that, I think it can be pointed out, or it can be traced back to that collective trauma. Just something to consider.
Absolutely.
Agreed. I also think that when we're looking and navigating the mental health space, you mentioned the example of it being a space that's normalized for maybe our white counterparts, right? Going to see a psychiatrist.
Yes.
I think we also have to recognize that as a society, that a lot of those things have been normalized. And so the way we show up in that space, even the research has not considered us at times. So as clinicians, we have to be mindful when we do have individuals of color that come and sit on our couch, we have to be mindful of how we look into this. So going into what you're saying, as far as the collective trauma, the community trauma as a whole. So it has to, there's education. That's what it was. That was a barrier.
Yeah.
Education was a barrier and a challenge because our community is showing up in this space. And sometimes if the education is there and the understanding of the complexity of the challenges that we experience as a community, if that education and understanding is not considered, then we will be treated like anyone else. And then it would appear as we're not compliant, we're resistant to services, right. Or we don't want help, right? When it's really, we need to tweak things to meet where we are due to the complexities that we experience as a community. So yes, I was thinking about that piece.
And that probably would lead to what we're working on in the I Belong Strong initiative through GRAAHI is the cultural competency training.
Yes.
And that will help the professionals to understand that there's a cultural component to the individuals of African American descent. When they come see you, you got to have a different approach. You have to have a better understanding of how to approach them with your therapeutical
your treatment, your
training.
approach.
Your approach has to be completely different. And so that's a real big piece. Yeah. It's a real big piece.
It's a huge piece. I kind of want to talk a little bit more about when we speak to the education of it, right? Because I think that the education related to mental health services, it can't always start just at the top, but it almost needs to be a part of the conversation that my teenage daughter is having, right? It's so important because when you are, let me back up for a second. I think it's safe to say that our children are growing up much faster than we would hope. I know that my daughter at 15 turning 16, what her life is and her experiences and what she has access to, but what she has to contend with is very different than what I had to deal with at 15 in 1994, right? It's a totally different world altogether. And what I had to deal with in 1994 was so much different than what my parents dealt with in, 1974, right? So the what they have to contend with is so much more because it used to be what was happening around them. Us as parents could kind of like isolate, but now with technology, like I can't keep the world out.
Right.
And not only can I not keep the world out, I can't keep her out of it.
Yeah.
So I have to equip her. So that's why conversations in our home are very open. But what it does is it forces me as mom to be very transparent. That's a dirty word we don't like to talk about. And vulnerable. That's also a curse word sometimes in the African American community, because many of us grew up with the whole adage of what happens in this house stays in this house. But what we were doing is we were equipping our loved ones to hide the fact that we needed someone to help us, right? So in our household, we have those conversations. Like, therapy is a thing for us. The education around it is a way of life. I believe in Jesus and the therapist because they saved my life. And I think that if more people were interested in allowing the education to be a part of the fundamentals of upbringing, then we would be able to change the perspective around the stigmas related to, and even some of the challenges. Because now, if you think about young adults these days, like, we have platforms. Social media is a platform. If I don't like something, like this cancel culture, how about we cancel barriers? Like, how about we cancel, you know, inequities? How about we cancel, like, I know we got this whole
but
Drake and all this foolishness. How about we do something that matter?
The fact that we've had to categorize the last 4 decades, Generation X, Generation Z, Generation this, Generation that, and what each one of those generations were affected by. You know, we had the babies whose moms were affected by drugs. We have a whole generation of those kids. Okay.
Yeah, us 80s babies.
That was one of the worst things that could have ever happened in our community.
Yes.
The next thing, like when I was in high school and college, there were no cell phones. We didn't even have cell phones. Now, cell phones. If you look at a teenager and you just look at their behavior, and you can see that cell phone is like it carries some type of spirit in it that controls them. And they've shown the babies where the babies are playing with the cell phone and the baby's doing great. Then you take the cell phone from the baby and the baby just cries, you know. That's the same thing teenagers are dealing with now. If you put them on punishment by taking away that cell phone, they will mope and groan. They will go to their rooms and withdraw. They won't go out to play. They don't interact with other kids. We have a whole generation of that. So that's going to be a problem. That's going to be a problem. It's like you said, Ashley, when it comes to education, I think we need to educate the parents to these things, these influences that is going to cause these dissonances, these barriers, you know, to them learning. And so I don't know that I don't have the answer, but I do know that these are the things that we need to address, and we are addressing some of them in the Grand Rapids African American Health Institute. And I just think it's one of the greatest things that I've been a part of, is to try to look deeply within our community and see why do we have these health disparities in our veterans, in our children, in African American women, and it's really a great thing to be a part of.
I know that definitely the cell phones, like, we can go on and on about that. What I also noticed, though, they have the language that I wish I had when I was younger.
Oh, yeah.
So if I can check in with teenagers, and I do often, I do groups, and I see some teens in therapy as well. They have the language. When I check in, they're not telling me I'm good. Sometimes they are, but they'll articulate that they're feeling anxious. They'll articulate that I've been feeling depressed. So what I do love is, with this upcoming generation, the future looks bright as it relates to mental health. I'll say that, as it relates to the understanding of mental health. Because like I said, I had people in my neighborhood, we didn't know what to call it. We just knew something was different about them, and we didn't talk about it. We just took care of them, like I mentioned earlier. And so these babies are now understanding, like, oh, I feel, anxiety in my chest, and they're able to describe it. So that's a beautiful thing. The other pieces we do need to work. So more communication, more conversations like this, and community conversations is so important. Workshops and things like that. But what I would say to the listeners is, you have a ability to be a mental health advocate as well. Yes. And that's by just starting some conversation with family members. Yes. How are you feeling? Yes. Doing a check-in. You can Google a emotions list. I'm real big about expanding my emotional vocabulary. Google it. Get your emotional vocabulary and look at that list and begin to identify, how do I feel? And have this conversation with your children, with your spouses, with your mothers, your fathers, because I think that's where we're going to see the change in our community when we normalize this conversation, that it's okay, you know, that you're feeling anxious. Let's talk about that. What does that look like? From the mouth of these babies. Yes. I hear it on a regular basis, and I love when I hear it. It excites me to hear them be able to articulate their emotions in that way. And so, that's something that inspired me to continue to do the work and continue to pour into young people.
Absolutely.
I think that emotional vocabulary is a tremendous resource. And I think just hearing you say that, and as I was listening to you, that's something that can be used across the board. It doesn't matter if you are a civilian or if you are a vet. It doesn't matter if I am a young adult, a teen, or if I am someone that's more seasoned in my years. How I feel is how I feel. And if I don't know what to say, this emotional vocabulary that we're referring to may be the tool that they need to start the conversation. Because I know we oftentimes talk about mental health as it pertains to, you know, young adults or teens. We even talk about postpartum, right? That's a whole different era. We're talking about vets, but there are people that are more seasoned persons in community that have lived through some generations. They've lived through some experiences, but because they're older, they're sometimes disregarded as if their mental health is not just as important. So the mental health of my 15-year-old daughter is just as critical as the mental health of my 61-year-old father and my 83-year-old grandmother, because we want people to live a quality of life. We want them to live life in that more abundantly, like the abundant life is your portion. You deserve to have that. It is your right. Right. Absolutely. So it's super important. And I think around the conversation around workshops and having these dialogues, I would hope that not just the listeners and the viewers that are community residents, but representatives of the community. I think that our pastors and our elders should be having these conversations at their churches. It doesn't matter what your denomination is, because the heart is the heart and the soul is the soul. So if we're saying that our churches are our place of refuge, I should be able to bring whatever, like the church is the hospital.
Absolutely.
I should be able to bring whatever is going on with me. And I think that sometimes having those, again, dirty word, vulnerable and transformative, right? Because vulnerability can be transformative. Having those kind of conversations can absolutely shift not just a life, but an entire legacy.
Absolutely. Something I often say, Ashley, I say it probably 50 times a week. When I'm honest about how I feel, I can get my needs met. And so when I talk about that emotional vocabulary, I charge the listeners and community members, pastors, all to take a moment to check in with yourself. You know, how do I feel? And using that emotional vocabulary list that you can Google can give you the opportunity to really like delve into, how do I really feel? Because we usually will go to, maybe I feel sad, or but that list, it expands things. You know, I'm confused, right? Or I feel embarrassed. So really, when I'm honest about how I feel, I can then get my needs met. And we all deserve to get our needs met. But we have to understand how we feel too.
And I think two things, and I know we're finishing up here, Ashley. Two things that I think the churches, the leaders in the church community can take into consideration. And what I use when I talk to young people in the schools, I'm speaking on Friday to some kids in the 8th grade at Alger Middle School, and I've been doing this for years as part of my outreach. I talk about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Absolutely.
I talk about Stephen H. Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, but I use the 7 Habits of Highly Effective Students, that model, and try to convey some things from that. And then I talk about emotional intelligence. Those 3 things and we give these kids some of those tools from these things, it'll help them to understand why it is I behave the way that I do. And try to address it from that aspect. And that's part of youth ministries in most churches, and it should be, I think. So those are some of the things that I think we can start to incorporate in addressing the problems.
Yeah. Okay. This has been such a beautiful conversation, and I know that there's so much more that we can dive into, and just this conversation along and with you two as this dynamic duo, I don't know, this might need to be a part two. But before we conclude here, I think that it would be important to just have a few final words of encouragement. So you know where your camera is and you know where yours is. But you can speak directly to the audience that's viewing and directly to the audience that's listening. We've talked about the importance of mental health. We've talked about the importance of having conversations and the education and access to resources, and many of the resources that we discussed during this podcast. Of course, you know, it'll be accessible by way of our website, by way of our social medias and things of that nature. But before we conclude, is there anything specifically that you want to just share, just words of encouragement, be it to civilians or veterans or population at large? Dr. Hudson, I'll let you go.
Well, you know, being a minister for 28 years, I've always got a sermon, but I'm not going to preach today. But the one thing that I always encourage people to do is have a testimony, faith, okay, encourage others, okay, charity, helping people who are in need, some of the basic things that we need to do in society. I think this can make a tremendous change in the way that we live. I try to be a change agent in my outreach ministry. My ministry is designed to meet people where they are, the correction facilities, the high schools, junior high and high schools, long-term care for senior residents, and the rehabilitation facilities for substance abuse. Those are the areas that I go to. And so we have to be the change that we seek. And so that's hopefully what my ministry will accomplish as I go further and deeper into it. Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, Ashley.
Absolutely.
This was awesome.
All right. I'll just bring it back to our physical is connected to our emotional. We pay a lot of attention to our physical, and that is great, as we should, but I think we need to pour as much attention into our emotional. In 2020, we were very, very conscious of the physical cough. We were very conscious of that. We paid close attention to the physical cough. And what I learned was we were ignoring or didn't have the capacity to pay attention to the emotional cough. And so that's a term that I start using in 2020. And that emotional cough is your mental health. That emotional cough is the sadness you may be experiencing or the anxiety you might experience. And that anxiety could look like worry constantly. It can look like having intrusive thoughts that are constantly coming up and getting in the way of you being able to show up and be your most present self. So I encourage you to pay attention to that emotional cough just as much as you pay attention to your physical cough. Therapy, like I said before, it can be scary to seek therapy. That can be real. I am a therapist with a therapist, okay? I am very, very, very much 10 toes down on this thing, and for myself and for my community. So if I'm a therapist and I have a therapist, I encourage you to seek therapy, because there are licensed professionals that look like you, that is willing to meet you where you are, to walk alongside you, and just kind of help you navigate the journey of healing, the journey of reaching your best self. Something I say to my clients when I first meet them is, I want to help you find your power position. And what your power position could look like, it can look like processing trauma, which will eventually get you to the other side and have you feel more like the best version of yourself. It can look like you learning how to manage anxiety, depression. It can look like you learning communication skills, setting boundaries. We are here for you. You deserve help. You deserve to be well, and you deserve to seek and find the best version of yourself. So thank you.
Right.
I love it. I love it. I really hope that all of our listeners and our viewers have heard something today that has encouraged them to do the hard thing. Like they both said, that it may be challenging, it may be scary, but you are worth it. You deserve the absolute best. So I'm hoping and praying that something that was said today sparked an interest for you to try the hard thing. If you find that you need someone to walk alongside you, not only do we have access to Dr. Hudson and we have access to Tashuna, but you also have access to our community health navigators here at GRAAHI. You can reach us by way of our website at www.graahi.com, or you can always give us a call here at the office at area code 616-331-5831. Above all things, we just want you to be well and prosper. So again, Dr. Hudson, thank you. Tashuna, thank you.
Thank you.
This has been beautiful. And to our viewers and our listeners, once again, my name is Ashley Jones, and this has been Curated Conversations, a podcast presented by GRAAHI. Until next time.